Good morning, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. My name is Alana Jordan, and I am the Development and Membership Director at Together SC. It's my pleasure to introduce Clay Grayson with the Grayson Law Firm. The Grayson Law Firm has been a longstanding consultant collaborative member of Together SC and works to serve as an external office of general counsel for nonprofit organizations. It is projected that in the next 18 years, there will be approximately $9 trillion in charitable and planned gifts made by baby boomers to nonprofit organizations. During the next 30 minutes, Clay is going to examine projected trend lines of this generational transfer of wealth while providing guidance that you might use to attract charitable giving towards your organization. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Clay. Thank you for joining us this morning, and we're excited about this presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this last coffee talk of the year that we'll be doing with Together SC. I hope you all have your coffees. This has been the topic that I've been most excited to present to the group. It's one that I'm very passionate about. And if you run into me at any time on the street or wherever, you can get me going pretty easily to talk about what I see happening with regard to charitable giving over the next 20 years. If you've got any questions, feel free to load it into the chat. I've got another, I'll try to keep an eye on it, and we'll definitely have some time at the end of today's session if we want to get into more questions or a bigger discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to load up my PowerPoint and let's jump on in. And let's see if this is going to work. All right, here we go. So I've titled the presentation Inspiring Donors Through Planned Giving Targeted Towards Endowments. So I think the two big elements there are planned gifts, what's a planned gift, and to talk about endowments and the relationship between planned gifts and endowments. And the reason I'm doing this is because there's a much greater macroeconomic trend that's going to affect both planned giving and endowments fairly significantly. And it's one that I don't think people are talking about quite enough yet, but I expect within the next decade, this will become a much more prevalent conversation among nonprofit professionals. And so maybe y'all can say you first heard it here. Looking at the numbers, if we're going to jump in, as of a year ago, Americans over the age of 70 had a net worth nearly $35 trillion. That's about 20% of all of the wealth in the United States. And for that group, it's up 20% from 3 decades ago. If you're looking at a big picture, this wealth of this group is about 157% of the US's gross domestic product. And it's double what it would have been about 30 years ago. So we see this massive, concentration of wealth within our older population. And as they're approaching the end of their life, we're now seeing that wealth being contemplated being transferred. And in terms of modern American history, this is, in fact, the largest transition of wealth that we've ever seen. You've got between in the next, between 2018 and 2042, you're looking at $70 trillion of amassed wealth going to heirs and beneficiaries. And you can see it now with your annual giving. We see tick ups with that generation. It's going up almost 75 billion in 2016. I think you're going to start seeing more and more gifts from this generation. If you look at it kind of graphically, this is a chart that I got from the Wall Street Journal, but it was drawn from a number of US federal statistics. You can see the trend line here from our period 2018 to 2022. The giving is, it's fine, but it's modest, but then you can see it accelerate and ramp up leading into 2038 to 2042 period, where you're going to see very, very significant transfer of wealth in that time period. Looking at the chart, the green are really bequests to heirs, to family, those kinds of things. The more, the darker sort of pink reddish color are bequests to charities. So those are planned gifts. And you can say not quite what the family gets, but you start getting out into those latter years, and that becomes a significant component to that bar chart. In terms of real numbers, it's expected to be $9 trillion over the next 20 years. And the statistic to me that's the most important and the most interesting one is, of that 9 trillion, 80% of that wealth is going to transfer to nonprofits through planned gifts. So these are gifts that are made through a person's will or some other estate planning instrument. That's $7.2 trillion. It's an incredible charitable giving and receiving opportunity for organizations. And this is the one thing I want to get folks, while we've got many years in front of us, are you thinking about it? Are you planning for it? What can you do in your organization to capitalize on this really tremendous opportunity and this tremendous sort of charitable perspective of the baby boomers? And my question to y'all, or really the question of the day, is how do we inspire someone to make a planned gift to your organization? What is it that's going to attract them to you? And what elements do you need to have in place to help them in that type of planned gift? So let's start by talking about the significance of the planned gift to a donor. In my mind, this is perhaps one of the greatest possible gifts an individual can do. It's your deathbed wish. This is the gift that you're making at the end of your life. And so to the extent you've got a larger philanthropic plan or vision, this is your opportunity to fulfill it. If you think about this, when I talk with fundraisers and we talk about, a donor's first goal is survival, providing for their family. And I think that's appropriate and as it should be. But once you get to the planned gift setting, survival is not part of the equation anymore. And what that means is it tends to be that planned gifts are often the largest charitable contributions to a nonprofit. And they can be of the greatest benefit to a nonprofit because typically you're not budgeting for their occurrence, or you're not planning when someone's gonna pass away and leave you a bequest. From what I've learned over time is that endowments are really built by planned gifts. And an endowment is sort of perfect when you really think about a donor's perspective on a planned gift. This is a gift that they could make, that the dollars will not be expended, only the income therefrom. And so this has got the ability to make your organization sustainable if you've got an endowment that's got a multi-generational impact. This is where we really make a difference with our organization year after year after year. It also, planned gifts to endowments can present opportunities to engage donors with your causes and things that they're going to be very passionate about. To me, this is a really wonderful tool to inspire a donor. Let's talk a little bit more about what is an endowment, because I think there's some real specific terminology to be aware of when you're considering, hey, can I set up an endowment that then potentially could become the target of a planned gift? So typically an endowment is an established fund of cash, securities, other assets, and you're looking to have it produce income to the organization. And the expenditures from an endowment are typically restricted to specific uses that are going to be related to your charitable mission. This could be to endow a program, to endow a scholarship, perhaps it's to endow a position in your organization. And it's those specific uses that really are at that moment of engagement or inspiration that can be provided to a donor. It's where you can get really targeted with someone in terms of their philanthropic intent. And typically endowments are going to be memorialized through some type of written indenture approved by your board. These are fairly simple documents, 2-3 pages. They typically state your purpose, what your expenditure restrictions would be, and then they set voting levels for the board to take action in connection with the endowment. And typically those voting levels are oftentimes higher because you don't want to have things change, and endowments are kind of fixed in stone in that way. They're very hard to unwind or really pivot in. And that's part of the reason why you set them up, is they're intended to be restricted and they're intended to have a very specific donor-driven purpose. So most endowments are established through permanent restrictions, although you can see some that are temporarily restricted. Permanently restricted endowments will restrict the principal in perpetuity, and the income is what's expendable year after year. And so these permanent restricted endowments are typically the most attractive to donors when considering a planned gift. And that sort of makes sense. If you think about a planned gift, it's occurring at the end of one's life. It's perhaps a percentage of their wealth. And the idea that they could restrict that wealth for the future so it can continue to make gifts from that bucket of money, that's a pretty impressive or neat kind of connection point to donors. And when they have that aha moment, when they realize they can do this type of end of life gift that's not going to impact their standard of living, or what they want to provide for themselves, or even how long they're going to live, we don't know that. That this sort of lines up in a very interesting way that their gift will keep on going years, perhaps decades after they're gone. There are really kind of two types of endowments that I like to talk to people about. The classic one that we most talk about is one created by a donor. So this is someone that's not in your organization, they're external to you, and it's done through a gift agreement, which becomes a binding contract between that donor and the organization. And thereafter, other donors can contribute into that same endowment bucket. What's important with this is, as a binding contract, this raises the level. What do you do when the donor's deceased, if they've made a planned gift? How do you make those changes? And that's a very difficult topic. We'll get to it in a minute, but it's also one of the ways and one of the reasons in which endowments become kind of set in stone, if you will. By contrast, a quasi-endowment is one that's created by a nonprofit board. And so it's not an external donor. And in a sense, it becomes the board making an agreement with itself with regard to the restriction of these assets. That's why they use the word quasi. Quasi in Latin means almost. So it's almost an endowment. And while, it can look permanently restricted, and maybe it's intended to be permanently restricted, because you don't have to go to a donor, or a donor that maybe is deceased, and how do you go to that person to make a change? The nonprofit board's got the ability to then modify or even unwind a quasi-endowment. And so I think it's important when you're in this area to understand which type you're dealing with, and sophisticated donors are aware of this. I actually find the quasi-endowment to be a great starting position for a nonprofit organization that's looking to take the leap and start, promoting or creating or establishing their first endowment. I say that because of that ability to make those changes. It's easier with a quasi-endowment because the board controls it. And, when you're doing something new, there's a little bit of an infrastructure lift. And if you've got to make course changes and adjustments, it's easier to do that in a quasi-endowment setting. If you're in a true endowment, you have to go back to that donor and request to have it amended, or, as we'll see in a second, under the South Carolina Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, you might have to go to court or the attorney general if the donor is no longer around. But that quasi-endowment does give you that ability to, kind of feel your way through. And the interesting thing with it is you could actually turn it from a quasi-endowment to a true endowment. You could have a donor then making a type of gift, and y'all kind of flip the switch and acknowledge you're dropping the quasi. And that's actually what I see a lot of nonprofits do. They start with the quasi-endowment. They get a critical mass of funds built up in there. Maybe they get a significant gift, and they use that significant gift to make it go firm and more set in stone. So looking at some numbers, if you're looking in higher education, in 2018, you saw endowment size of $648 billion. That was a year-to-year increase that year of 9%. In that same year, the top 36 healthcare foundations held $370 billion in assets. Not sure they've got quite that amount now with the markets, but we're talking about it as significant concentrations of wealth to promote charitable organizations long past any donor's natural life. So how do you inspire a donor to make a planned gift? One of the things I like words, and I've always enjoyed the etymology of words. And for me, looking into the word philanthropy a couple of years ago was had kind of a series of aha moments. It originated in the ancient Greek play Prometheus Bound. I think it's about 2,500 years old at this point, and it's a combination of two Greek words, philos, which means love of or an empathic love of, and anthropia, meaning humankind. So it literally means an empathetic love of humanity. And it originated in the myth of Prometheus. And y'all may recall Prometheus stole fire to give to his creation in Greek mythology. Prometheus molded humankind out of clay, stole fire from Zeus, and then he was placed on a mountain where an eagle or a vulture picked at his liver every night to regenerate. But it was his love of mankind, that philanthropia, which is where this term originated. What's also interesting from a word perspective, Prometheus, the name, actually means foresight in Greek as well. And so when you kind of think about philanthropy and its origination, at least in Western civilization in ancient Greece, you might think about it in terms of the sentence, because foresight had an empathetic love for humankind. Foresight endowed it with civilization, language, technology, science, and arts, which is a pretty kind of lovely concept if you think about it. And the reason I say this is because I think a lot of times individuals don't think of themselves in terms of being a philanthropist or philanthropy. And to me, that's a distinction here. And that's a way that you can, someone that's engaged with your organization, you can start getting them to think about themselves as a philanthropist. You can get them to start thinking about their own empathy and their own foresight and forethought. And suddenly that gets you started in a really a nice kind of planned gift discussion. You're drawing on someone's lifetime of experience and knowledge for the issues that they care about, and giving them that opportunity to take a portion of their wealth and then endow it permanently restricted, so the income coming therefrom is going to drive and sustain your nonprofit and your mission perhaps forever. That's a great sell. That's a great conversation if you can get to that point with a donor. The other things to do is really on the kind of the administrative side. And philanthropist donors that are aware of this area, that are knowledgeable, are going to also want to see, not just to have your pitch, not just what are you talking about doing here with their funds long after they've passed away, but they're going to want to see that you've got strong internal controls, that you've got disciplined, conservative investment track record, so they know that the funds are going to be utilized in the most efficient and appropriate way. One way to look at this, and economists will talk about endowments in terms of intergenerational equity, which is a term that basically tracks, or it's looking at the purchasing power of your endowment from one generation to the next. So if you can buy more things, if your endowment's kicking out more income, from year to year, from one generation to the next, in theory, then you're building intergenerational equity around your nonprofit. And to me, that's one of the greatest measures of one's fiduciary responsibilities in this space. And that's perhaps in my mind, the best way to really evaluate an organization's board of directors. The other thing that I like to tell folks to do is, it's not just giving your pitch. It's not just demonstrating good financial controls and good investment strategy. It's also about that relationship with the donor, with the philanthropist. And these are relationships that are cultivated over years in my mind. You're starting off with someone who's maybe doing annual gifts, moving them to major gifts, and then ultimately helping them realize a significant and material planned gift. But what I would tell you is that planned gift discussion starts today, starts day one. It's something that you can plant the seeds for over years. And in fact, if someone is actually going ahead and pledging and committing to the planned gift, which we're going to talk about in a second, I think it's critical that you seek ways to honor them prior to their death. That becomes the greatest way to ensure the planned gift will be successful. Because if you think about it, a person can change their will, a person can change any of these techniques before they pass away. And there's no way to necessarily know if it's going to actually occur. You mitigate that by acknowledging and honoring the donor before they're deceased, which, honestly is just, frankly, it's a nice, good thing to do. In terms of, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the other elements that would go around your endowment if you're setting up one of these programs. There are three basic policies that I think are must-haves. There is an investment policy statement. This is the policy that in which your board lays out how they want to invest the funds, how conservative they're going to be. We talk about today, people talk about ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues. This is actually a topic that is very in tune in investment policy statements. Are you going to direct your investment managers to then look for investment opportunities that are consistent with your ESG beliefs and metrics to measure them? Or are they just looking to get the greatest possible return under some type of modern portfolio theory where you're not necessarily caring about what you're investing in, but caring about the return you can get from? And to me, I think what I'm seeing in the space, nonprofits are becoming significantly more in tune with ESG. If you think about it, there's a great consultant on the West Coast, Vuli, who's come and done some work with Together SC over the years. And he describes, if you've got $1 billion endowment, why would you put that in a series of investments that perhaps have no viewpoint in ESG or relationship to your charitable mission, such that perhaps these investments are creating the greater disparities in the market, the gaps that your nonprofit's trying to address, when all you're kicking out is perhaps a 5% return from that massive investment to then address those gaps. It is a head scratcher, and it makes one realize that there's got to be a better way. And your investment policy statement becomes a mechanism by which you can align your investments with your mission and start developing more mission-related investment strategies. So not only is your income coming out supporting your programs, but the investments themselves may support aspects of society or economy that's consistent with your greater vision or view of the world. Related to the investment policy statement, perhaps the corollary, the other side of the coin, is a spending or distribution policy. So you've got to state how much are you going to spend each year coming out of it. Now, many times people in the early years will have a no spend, and they do this to accumulate principal, and I see that frequently. Once you've gotten to a good point, though, and you are kicking out funds, the key is to set your spending rate at a level that is not going to exceed return after inflation. So you've got to be able to not overspend. If you do, and inflation's taking away, which is a big risk today, then suddenly that intergenerational equity, that purchasing power, is going to diminish, and you're going to see your endowment shrink in size. And so a sophisticated investor is going to be looking at, hey, I want to see your investment policy statement. I want to see your spending policy. And then finally, you need to have policies related to administrative fees with the endowment. Endowments, when they grow in size, can become very expensive to manage. Typically, if you're setting one of these up, it's fine. Most people put the funds in laddered CDs, and you do that for a while, and then maybe you get $100,000, $200,000, and you move into mutual funds, perhaps a Vanguard, low fee cost. But eventually, if you start getting some traction and you're getting over $1 million, or at some point you decide, listen, I gotta do some more significant investment. And at that point, if you haven't reserved the right to pay for investment managers, pay all those fees associated with that work at that level, then that's a challenge. That's a problem. It's one of those things, perhaps if you had a quasi endowment, your board can then make an adjustment and indicate that fees can be drawn from the endowment to cover these kinds of costs. The donor agreement. This is also very critical. So typically with a true endowment, not a quasi, you've actually got a gift agreement in place. And the gift agreement can cover, how much you're going to pay. Is it going to be over a series of years? Is it going to be a follow-up plan gift at the end of life? Most organizations will set a minimum level of contributions or timeline to get that endowment funded. Maybe it's 25,000, maybe it's 500,000. You typically can deal with donor recognition, or although some folks want to be anonymous. If they do want to be anonymous in South Carolina under our Freedom of Information Act, at the time of the gift, it has to be stated and documented. So this is really the place where you would do that. And then finally, the most important aspect of this is what happens in the future if there's a change of circumstances and something needs to get unwound. If a donor is deceased and this is an agreement with the donor, what do you do? Sometimes gift agreements will have written in there the donor already is allowing the board to make those changes under very special circumstances. But if you don't have anything that addressed in your gift agreement, South Carolina law would instruct you in most cases, you're having to go to the Attorney General's office, notifying them of the change, and typically bringing in an action in court. So again, this is another reason why I say endowments are kind of set in stone. It's not going to be easy to make these changes, particularly after a donor's deceased. And you don't want to. That's sort of the point of the endowment, right? With the gift agreement, I do give those 3 policies to donors. I've seen folks get them to initial the policies or sign a page acknowledging they've received those documents as well. This is important because those policies are, in a sense, an element of your contract, of your agreement. And courts of law will look to those kind of elements in addition to the gift agreement to determine what the transaction was, what was the intent of the donor, and what were the responsibilities of the nonprofit organization. Related to that, because courts can look beyond just the gift agreement, I think it's really important to track and record your notes of intent in your file. I don't know if you're using a CRM, maybe the Blackbaud product, or just kind of managing it yourself internally. But those files, what I see with endowments down the road, if there's an issue or something needs to be changed, that record becomes very critical to inform the agreement and inform what's going on. I also think it's a good idea, or I counsel donors or philanthropists to let their family be aware of this. If there's any unexpected surprise, particularly with a planned gift at death, you can suddenly get into a probate dispute, and nobody wants that kind of stuff in this space. CASE, I don't know if y'all are familiar with CASE. It's the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. They put a lot of standards about fundraising. They would advise to get a memorandum of donor intent. So you just got some written document about a planned gift. Sometimes you can get a donor to give you a copy of their will, or maybe if they're planned gift, they really just changed the beneficiary in the IRA to be your organization, getting a copy of that. Anything like that you can build in the record is going to be helpful and increase the chance of a successful planned gift. One thing I would tell people, some people say, well, can we make it irrevocable? And the answer is yes, you can, but you may not want to. And the reason I say that is, let's say someone makes an irrevocable pledge, but they go ahead and change their will. My question to you is, are you actually going to bring suit in probate court to fulfill that pledge? And my experience is that happens. I've done that. I've filed creditors' claims in estates before, but it's not a good look on a nonprofit. And you really don't want to make a habit of that. People will know that, and it'll discourage other folks from making gifts and pledges. And then finally, we talked about this before. I think you can honor your donor now for a future planned gift. So if they've signed a memorandum of donor intent and you make it kind of a ceremony, you bring them to your annual luncheons, you have your follow-ups. To me, that's also critical to complete the gift. So, couple final thoughts. If you're kind of new to this area, I think there's a real easy way to get started. And I think you can use your website to position your organization to make this easy for donors. And what I'm talking about is more of a service model. So let's say you want to attract donors to make planned gifts through an endowment. You can set up a web page on your site. You could have case study materials about what your endowment's going to do, how the income that kicks off of the principal affects people's lives in very impactful ways. You can detail ways to do a planned gift. I tell people to put a sample will codicil. This is the kind of thing that if a donor is talking with their estate planning attorney and the attorney is saying, well, do you want to give to a charity? And they identify they could already know to direct their attorney to your website. They can get the name of your organization correct. I've seen that before, and that gets to be an unfortunate expense and can lead to litigation. They can also identify what proper endowment they want to give to, and it becomes a place where you can give them all those policies, give them a copy of your endowment indenture, and really just makes it self-service so a donor can step in and I've got everything I need to do a planned gift. And at that point, hopefully you're opening the mail and suddenly you've got a check. To me, getting this sort of basic passive self-service model is a great way to get going if you don't have one of these programs in place. And then finally, this is $7.2 trillion in planned gifts over the next 20 years. We've got a lot of time to get in front of this. You've got a lot of time to think about setting up an endowment, inspiring your donor base to make a planned gift. And honestly, I really do think it's as easy as your board creating a quasi endowment, publishing what you're doing on your website, and then giving basic directions so that donors can approach this in a self-serve manner. I mean, to me, this is a huge opportunity that I don't want anybody to miss. So with that, I don't know if we have any questions, but that concludes the presentation. I'm a little bit over in time, but I'm happy to stick around if there are any questions or discussion.
Yeah, Clay, thank you. I know we had one question. What's the difference between a gift and a bequest?
In a sense, it depends on whether you're alive or not, and maybe they can be used in a colloquial sense interchangeably. But a gift would be when I'm alive, I'm giving you something, it's me to you. Versus a bequest would be a gift that occurs in one's will or some other testamentary disposition. And so when we talk about planned gifts, those are gifts that come through a will. They're triggered by a donor's death.
Okay. And, I was thinking about it, and I think we might have some smaller organizations, maybe their budgets aren't as big, but what's kind of the range you're seeing of planned gifts as far as like a minimum and obviously a maximum?
Well, so planned gifts are interesting because they can be stated in terms of percentages of your wealth. And when a lot of folks, if you're coming from sort of a Christian tithing perspective, if you think about it, I'm going to give to my church or I'm going to give to this community foundation 10% of my accumulated wealth, you can see very significant gifts. But they range in size. You can get them from $1,000 to, I've seen them from $1,000 to millions of dollars. There's not a right or wrong way. The tricky thing with endowments is people will get worried that you're directing money from your day-to-day operations. And I don't think that's the right way to think about it, particularly if you're focusing your planned gifts to endowments. Nobody budgets for a planned gift. No one expects it. So when they come in, if they're getting directed into an endowment, they're going to keep on going. And it's sort of in a parallel track to achieve sustainability. So it really doesn't matter if you're starting with $25,000 to get one going or starting with $1 million or more. If you're planning it that way, it can really operate on its own and not affect your day-to-day operations. But again, if you do need those funds, we could go to the Attorney General and to courts, and you can unwind some things too.
Okay, that's good to know. We had another question come in. Would you recommend using a community foundation for an endowment?
Absolutely, 100%. For a number of reasons. I'm down here on the coast. Our community foundation here is excellent. They give you a lot of options. And what's great is, particularly if you're in a starter mode, you can lean into their infrastructure to account for all of these things. And they themselves are investment managers in a sense. So you've got kind of a nonprofit oriented investment manager that's going to get you. So I think community foundations are a great place to partner with in this space.
Fantastic. Well, I think that is all of the questions. If anyone has any additional questions, you can put them in the chat. We will be able to share the presentation to everyone after. And just to let you all know, Clay, thank you so much. This has been very informative, and we appreciate you taking the time to do this series with us and our members. As always, we have events on our knowledge calendar. I'm going to put that link in the chat for any other upcoming events. We have a few in-person events coming up for our operations peer network, and then we have an Advocacy Allies in-person meetup. It's going to talk about post-election items. So, and then I also want to make sure we're starting to think about our nonprofit summit that will be March 7th, 8th, and 9th in Columbia. Be sure to put it on your calendar. And yeah, we're excited about it. So thank you all so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate you and your time. And yeah, I hope everyone has a great Wednesday. Thank you, Clay. We appreciate you.
Thank you all.